Hi everyone, welcome to Polymarket Research, my new channel. This channel is about independent, evidence-based analysis of major geopolitical and macroeconomic events, focused on how real-world constraints shaped outcomes over time through the logic of political economy. This is episode 1 of the series, and we are starting with a question that's been dominating headlines. Will Iran's current regime hold under mounting internal and external pressure? I'll keep this structured. We'll go through some background, introductions about the protest, and about the currency depreciation. And then we'll dive deeper into the power structure, the coercive apparatus of the Iranian state, and finally a timeline-calibrated stress test based on the current US military deployment and based on historical evidence. This is not affiliated with Polymarket, and this content is educational only. It is not financial advice. So the question is, will the Iranian regime fall by March the 31st, or by June the 30th, or before 2027? Iran is facing renewed domestic strain as its currency hits record lows, inflation squeezes households, and repeated protests flared across multiple provinces. Reuters reported the currency slid to new lows in the late January amid demonstrations that began in late December over economic hardship, while other reporting described an early January internet shutdown that disrupted online commerce and pushed small businesses towards collapse. The protest time-lapse maps capture how unrest have reappeared in dispersed clusters rather than a single isolated flashpoint, underscoring a broader, persistent pressure cycle. This brings us to the question, is the Iranian regime approaching a breaking point in the given timeline? Let's first examine the power structure, and then we'll know why even removing Khamenei won't topple the regime. Iran is not a purely personalist regime where removing the top leader automatically collapses the system. The Islamic Republic fuses religious authority with state power, so legitimacy is not just enforced through coercion. It is also institutionalized through clerical structures that can regenerate a leadership. In practice, this makes decapitation a transition problem for the ruling coalition, not necessarily an existential crisis for the regime. Crucially, Iran's constitution embeds a committee-based succession logic. The supreme leader is formally selected by the Assembly of Experts, which provides an institutional pathway for continuity even after the shock at the top. In the interim, the system also provides for a temporary collective arrangement to exercise core leadership functions until a successor is chosen. That means a leadership removal can be absorbed as an elite coordination process inside the existing power framework rather than opening an automatic road to regime change. This resilience is strengthened by the regime's long-term ideological filtering. Over time, the Islamic Republic has become more conservative, while reformist factions have been structurally marginalized through vetting and exclusion from key power channels. As a result, the pool of viable successor and decision makers is already tilted towards continuity. The power center is also singular and explicit, which reduces the risk of chaotic fragmentation at the moment of succession. Elites have strong incentives to unify around a new supreme leader to preserve institutional survival. When talking about the case of Khamenei in Iran, people might think of the case of Maduro of Venezuela. However, Iran is largely different with this case of Maduro because it's essentially authorities based on fear versus authorities based on concessions, and the authorities they could wield are hugely different in levels and magnitude. Maduro's rule is closer to concessions-based authority. The regime sustained loyalty through some charisma and politicized distribution, most notably subsidized food and Medicare, to the poor that can reward supporters and punish dissenters. Iran, by contrast, is largely different. It leans more towards fear-based authority. Economic hardship matters, but regime survival is primarily tied to whether coercive apparatus remain cohesive and willing to enforce control. Collapse risk rises when the coercive stack fractures, hesitates, or loses operational capacity. The Islamic Republic's most reliable, loyal guard is not just a set of armed units. It is an integrated political economy anchored in Islamic legitimacy plus a Leninist party-state logic, and enforced by the coercive stack led by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and Basij, and paramilitary organization. What makes the IRGC particularly durable is that it is not merely a military organization, it is also financially self-sufficient, privilege-protected economic class. Open source estimates vary widely, but the common range is that IRGC-linked networks control roughly a third of Iran's overall economy, both formal and informal combined. Even if the current regime were to weaken, an armed organization that owns companies, controls procurement channels, and profits from semi-formal markets can persist as a power center precisely because it is not fully dependent on the state budget. A coercive apparatus with its own revenue streams, ideological training, and layered force options is structurally positioned to outlast leadership shocks and to resist any rapid change, unless it fractures internally or loses operational capacity. Just now we proved the strength of the Iranian regime, which seems to contradict with any assumption of regime collapse. But we could still imagine the opposite and see the worst case scenario. So just set the regime were to collapse. But then we could still use historical experience to avoid being systematically too fast or too slow in our estimates of future events. The point is that regime change is rarely a single-day event triggered by one dramatic headline. It is usually a longer process in which coercive capacity, elite cohesion, and legitimacy, and state finance capabilities erode over time. Even when a regime crosses the psychological threshold of firing on its own people, it does not automatically translate into immediate collapse. Tsarist Russia violently suppressed unrest in 1905 on the street of Moscow. Yet, the monarchy only fell more than a decade later in 1917. Likewise, external shocks do not guarantee rapid overthrow either. Saddam Hussein's regime survived the 1991 Gulf War and reasserted control domestically after being defeated by the coalition. It was only removed after the full-scale ground invasion by the coalition in 2003. We have some understanding now about the internal power structure of this Iranian state, and now we could turn our attention to the US-Iran negotiations, because that would largely determine the possibility of a US military involvement in the affair. Iran is unlikely to accept reported US demands to destroy its nuclear facilities, sends its highly enriched uranium to the US, and a commitment to a permanent deal. In addition to the talks on uranium in talks to nuclear facilities, there are also U.S. concerns on Iranian's developments in ballistic missiles, and some say ICBMs, so intercontinental ballistic missiles. The United States and Iran held a third round of nuclear talks in Geneva on February the 26th. The Iranian proposal does not meet core US demands, and Iran is trying to offer economic incentives that are unrelated to US demands in order to extract concessions from the US. US officials have previously stated that the US would strike Iran if two sides cannot reach a deal. Now that we have concluded that the negotiations might not come to any fruition, so it's important to study the US military buildup since January. And since January the 14th, the US has continuously increased force deployments in Iran's vicinity, in the Middle East, in Europe. As of February 23rd, open source tallies indicate that the US Navy and Air Force have assembled at least 280 tactical aircraft across Europe, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the Arabian Sea, specifically 30 F-35A, 12 F-35C, 70 F-15E, 12 F-22As, 84 F-A-18EF. These are obviously carrier-based forces, and 60 F-16C series, and 12 A-10C, along with 55 reconnaissance and electronic warfare aircraft, including 3 MQ-4C, 2 RQ-4B, 5 E-11A, and 6 E-3G, 6 P-8A, 3 RC-135 VW, and 1 RC-135S variant, 10 E-2D, 18 EA-18G, and 1 U-2S, plus 109 aerial refueling tankers, which are KC-46A and KC-135, which are very important in supporting the in the aerial campaign. In parallel, the U.S. Navy has concentrated 8 destroyers, 6 littoral combat ships, LCS, and 2 aircraft carriers, with possibly more than 1 attack submarine deployed across the Arabian Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. Notably, because Israel is highly likely to participate in combat operations, the Israeli Air Force, a formidable force with 290 tactical aircraft and 14 aerial refueling tankers, should also be included. Taken together with Allied aviation, the total available air power exceeds 700 aircrafts, sufficient to sustain weeks of large-scale airstrikes. Based on the likely call intent, the operational concept points to a high-intensity air campaign closer in character to Kosovo in 1999 than to the limited punitive strike, aimed at degrading Iran's military capability, governance capability, and even basic public service capability. Target sets would plausibly include military command elements and senior leadership nodes, integrated air defenses, missile retaliation capability, other military infrastructure, nuclear facilities, regime paramilitary institutions, oil productions and storage, and wider civilian agencies and infrastructure. The scale of such a target list would be enormous and would heavily test the U.S. munition stocks. If Iranian resistance persists, the campaign logic could expand toward broader infrastructure disruption to impair basic economic functioning, catalyze internal disorder, or erode the state's ability to rule. In scale terms, while matching the Iraq War in 2003 would also require a comparably massive bomber posture, adding Israeli participation and US bombers staged in Europe would bring the air component close to a major war footprint. And after such a costly and time-consuming deployment, the key implication is that Washington and Pentagon is preserving a credible option set for actual use, not merely signaling. So naturally, we arrive at the final question. Will the regime survive under maximum US intervention? And here's my estimate. So even under maximum US intervention, the regime is still more likely to hold. Air power can inflict heavy damage and raise social stress, but without the help of ground invasion, it does not reliably produce regime change unless it also fractures the coercive apparatus and the elite coalition. Conditions that are difficult to force from outside without a decisive internal split. Thank you for sticking to the end of the video. So this is our first video, and if you like this channel, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.